The history of the United States is like an iceberg. At the surface, we see the familiar, iconic events, celebrated figures, and stories we've been taught for generations. But beneath that surface lies a deeper, more complex world of forgotten events, lesser-known struggles, and untold truths that have shaped the nation in ways we rarely acknowledge. Today, we're taking a journey through 6 levels of U.S. history. Each layer represents a different depth of knowledge, from well-known milestones to stories buried in the shadows of time. Some will surprise you, some may unsettle you, and others might completely change the way you see American history. Let's dive into the iceberg of United States history and uncover the mysteries beneath the surface. Declaration of Independence, 1776. The Declaration of Independence, adopted on July 4, 1776, is a seminal document in American history that formally announced the 13 colonies' decision to break free from British rule. Drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson, it articulated the colonies' grievances against King George III and outlined the philosophical justification for their separation. The Declaration begins with a powerful preamble that asserts the inherent rights of all individuals, emphasizing life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as unalienable rights granted by the Creator. It asserts that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that people have the right to alter or abolish any government that becomes destructive to these ends. Following this philosophical foundation, the document transitions to a detailed list of grievances against the British Crown, highlighting abuses of power and violations of the colonists' rights. Among the accusations are the king's refusal to assent to laws deemed necessary for the public good, imposing taxes without consent, dissolving legislative bodies, and maintaining a standing army in peacetime without legislative approval. These grievances illustrate the extent to which the colonists felt their rights as English subjects had been systematically denied. The Declaration concludes with a resolute statement of independence, proclaiming that the colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. It asserts their ability to establish alliances, levy war, conclude peace, and engage in all acts typical of sovereign nations. The signers, representing the colonies, pledged their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor to uphold this bold declaration, fully aware of the risks involved. The Declaration of Independence is not only a proclamation of political separation, but also a profound statement of universal human rights. Its principles have inspired countless movements for freedom and equality worldwide, establishing it as a cornerstone of democratic ideals. The document continues to be celebrated as a symbol of courage, resilience, and the enduring quest for liberty. U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights. The U.S. Constitution, drafted in 1787 and ratified in 1788, is the foundational framework for the government of the United States, designed to establish a system of governance that balances power, protects individual rights, and promotes stability. Emerging from the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, it replaced the Articles of Confederation, which had proven inadequate for managing the needs of a growing and diverse nation. The Constitution begins with a preamble that outlines its purpose: to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty. The document is organized into 7 articles, each addressing a fundamental aspect of government. It defines the structure and powers of the 3 branches: the legislative, executive, and judicial. The legislative branch, composed of the House of Representatives and the Senate, holds the power to make laws, regulate commerce, and declare war. The executive branch, led by the President, is responsible for enforcing laws, conducting foreign policy, and serving as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. The judicial branch, headed by the Supreme Court, interprets laws and ensures their alignment with the Constitution. The Constitution also establishes the principle of checks and balances, ensuring that no single branch of government becomes too powerful. Additionally, it outlines the process for amending the document, allowing for adaptation over time to meet changing societal needs. The first 10 amendments, collectively known as the Bill of Rights, were added in 1791 to address concerns about protecting individual liberties and limiting government power. The Bill of Rights guarantees fundamental freedoms and rights that are central to American identity. It ensures freedom of speech, religion, and the press, the right to assemble and petition the government, and the right to bear arms. Protections against unreasonable searches and seizures, self-incrimination, and cruel and unusual punishment are enshrined, as are rights to a fair trial and due process of law. The 10th Amendment reserves powers not delegated to the federal government to the states or the people, emphasizing the importance of federalism. Together, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights provide a blueprint for democratic governance and the protection of individual freedoms. Their enduring principles have shaped the development of the United States and continue to influence democratic systems worldwide. These documents represent a commitment to justice, liberty, and the rule of law, embodying the aspirations of a nation founded on the ideals of self-governance and individual dignity. Civil War, 1861 to 1865. The Civil War, fought from 1861 to 1865, was a defining conflict in American history, pitting the northern states, known as the Union, against the southern states that had seceded to form the Confederacy. The war arose from deep-seated tensions over issues such as slavery, states' rights, and economic differences, culminating in a national crisis after decades of compromise and conflict. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, who opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories, was a breaking point for southern states, leading to their secession and the formation of a separate government. The war began with a Confederate attack on Fort Sumter in April 1861, signaling the start of a brutal and protracted conflict. The Union, with its industrialized economy and larger population, initially believed the war would be short-lived, but the Confederacy's strong military leadership and commitment to its cause prolonged the fighting. Major battles such as Antietam, Gettysburg, and Vicksburg marked turning points in the war, each illustrating the staggering human cost and strategic complexity of the struggle. Slavery was a central issue, and as the war progressed, it became clear that its abolition was intertwined with the Union's goals. In 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring freedom for enslaved people in Confederate-held territories. This not only altered the moral and political stakes of the war, but also paved the way for the eventual abolition of slavery nationwide. The participation of African American soldiers in the Union Army further underscored the connection between the war effort and the fight for freedom. The war's conclusion came in April 1865, when Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses South Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Shortly afterward, President Lincoln was assassinated, casting a shadow over the Union's victory and the nation's future. The Civil War left an indelible mark on the United States, resulting in the deaths of more than 600,000 people and widespread destruction, particularly in the South. The war resolved the question of secession and preserved the Union, but it also left deep scars that would take generations to heal. The abolition of slavery, formalized by the 13th Amendment, was a monumental achievement, yet the promises of equality and civil rights remained unfulfilled for many. The Reconstruction era that followed sought to rebuild the nation and integrate formerly enslaved people into American society, but it faced significant resistance and setbacks. The Civil War remains a pivotal chapter in American history, a testament to the nation's capacity for resilience and change even amid profound division. It reshaped the United States politically, socially, and economically, laying the groundwork for future struggles and progress in the pursuit of justice and equality. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. Martin Luther King Jr. was a central figure in the Civil Rights Movement, a transformative struggle during the mid-20th century aimed at ending racial segregation and discrimination in the United States. Born in 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia, King emerged as a leader who combined moral clarity, powerful oratory, and non-violent resistance to challenge the entrenched systems of inequality that oppressed African Americans. His leadership was grounded in the philosophy of non-violence and civil disobedience, inspired by Mahatma Gandhi and rooted in his Christian faith. The civil rights movement gained national prominence in the 1950s and 1960s, with King playing a leading role in pivotal events that sought to dismantle segregation and secure equal rights. One of his earliest major achievements was the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 to 1956, sparked by Rosa Parks' arrest for refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger. King's leadership during the boycott demonstrated the power of coordinated, non-violent action and resulted in the desegregation of public buses in Montgomery. King went on to lead campaigns across the South, addressing issues of voting rights, school integration, and economic justice. He founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, to mobilize communities and sustain the momentum of the movement. The Birmingham Campaign in 1963 highlighted the brutality of segregation, drawing national attention to the plight of African Americans through images of protesters, including children, being attacked with fire hoses and police dogs. This campaign was accompanied by King's famous letter from Birmingham jail, in which he articulated the moral imperative of confronting injustice and the urgency of civil rights activism. Later that year, King delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Speaking before a massive crowd gathered at the Lincoln Memorial, he envisioned a future where people would be judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. The speech resonated deeply, becoming a defining moment in the movement and cementing King's legacy as a symbol of hope and justice. The civil rights movement achieved significant legislative victories, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These landmark laws outlawed segregation in public places and prohibited discriminatory voting practices, respectively, marking a major step toward legal equality. King's efforts, however, extended beyond legislation. He sought to address systemic poverty and economic inequality, as evidenced by his leadership in the Poor People's Campaign. Tragically, King's life was cut short when he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, on April 4, 1968. His death was a devastating blow to the movement, but his legacy endured. King's vision of equality and justice continues to inspire generations, serving as a reminder of the power of collective action and the ongoing struggle for civil rights. The civil rights movement, with King at its forefront, reshaped American society, challenging deeply rooted systems of oppression and laying the groundwork for future progress in the fight against racial injustice. World Wars I and II. World Wars I and II were two of the most devastating and transformative conflicts in human history, reshaping the global political landscape and altering the course of the 20th century. World War I, also known as the Great War, erupted in 1914 after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, an event that triggered a complex web of alliances and rivalries among major powers. The conflict pitted the Allied powers, including France, Britain, and later the United States, against the Central Powers, led by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. It was characterized by trench warfare, immense loss of life, and the use of new technologies such as tanks, machine guns, and chemical weapons. The war ended in 1918 with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, which imposed harsh reparations on Germany and redrew national boundaries, but it left unresolved tensions that contributed to future conflict. World War II, which began in 1939, was even more destructive and global in scope. Sparked by the aggressive expansionism of Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler, as well as imperial ambitions of Japan and Italy, the war involved nearly every major nation and was fought across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. It was marked by atrocities such as the Holocaust, where millions of Jews and other minorities were systematically murdered, and by major military campaigns, including the Battle of Stalingrad, the Normandy invasion, and the Pacific island hopping strategy. The war also saw the development and use of unprecedented military technologies, including radar, advanced aircraft, and ultimately atomic weapons, which were used by the United States to force Japan's surrender in 1945. Both wars had profound consequences. World War I led to the fall of empires, the rise of new nations, and the creation of the League of Nations, an early attempt at international cooperation that ultimately failed to prevent another global conflict. World War II resulted in the emergence of the United States and the Soviet Union as superpowers and the establishment of the United Nations, designed to foster peace and prevent future wars. It also accelerated decolonization as European powers weakened and former colonies sought independence. The human cost of both wars was staggering, with millions of soldiers and civilians killed, wounded, or displaced. The wars reshaped economies, societies, and international relations, giving rise to movements for human rights, technological innovation, and ideological struggles that would define the Cold War era. Together, these conflicts underscored the devastating potential of modern warfare and the need for international collaboration to maintain peace in an interconnected world. The Great Depression, 1930s. The Great Depression of the 1930s was a severe global economic downturn that had profound and lasting effects on societies and economies worldwide. It began in the United States with a stock market crash of October 1929, often referred to as Black Tuesday, which wiped out millions of investors' wealth and set off a chain reaction of economic failures. The causes of the Great Depression were complex and included overproduction in agriculture and industry, a decline in consumer spending, excessive speculation in financial markets, and weaknesses in the banking system. The impact of the Great Depression was immediate and devastating. In the United States, unemployment soared to nearly 25%, with millions of people losing their jobs, homes, and savings. Banks failed at alarming rates as panicked depositors withdrew their funds, leading to a collapse of credit and a deepening of the economic crisis. Industrial production plummeted, and international trade declined sharply, exacerbated by protectionist measures such as the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which imposed high tariffs on imported goods. The social consequences of the Great Depression were profound. Families struggled to afford basic necessities, with many relying on soup kitchens and charity for survival. Farmers faced plummeting crop prices and widespread foreclosures, compounded by the Dust Bowl, a series of severe droughts and dust storms that devastated the Great Plains. Entire communities were uprooted as people migrated in search of work, often facing discrimination and hardship in new regions. In response to the crisis, governments around the world implemented a variety of policies to address the economic collapse. In the United States, President Franklin D. Roosevelt introduced the New Deal, a series of programs and reforms aimed at providing relief to the unemployed, stimulating economic recovery, and reforming financial systems to prevent future crises. Initiatives such as the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, the Works Progress Administration, WPA, and the Social Security Act provided jobs, infrastructure development, and safety nets for the vulnerable. Financial reforms, including the establishment of the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, sought to restore trust in banks and markets. Globally, the Great Depression had far-reaching political implications. Economic hardship fueled the rise of authoritarian regimes in countries like Germany, Italy, and Japan, where leaders exploited public discontent to consolidate power and pursue aggressive policies that would ultimately lead to World War II. The economic crisis also shifted perspectives on government intervention in the economy, laying the groundwork for modern welfare states and reshaping economic thought. The Great Depression left a lasting legacy, highlighting the interconnectedness of global economies and the vulnerabilities of unregulated markets. It underscored the importance of social safety nets and government oversight in mitigating economic inequality and instability. The resilience and adaptability of individuals and communities during this period remain a testament to the human spirit in the face of extraordinary adversity. 9/11 terrorist attacks, 2001. The September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks were a devastating event that profoundly altered the course of history, leaving an indelible mark on the United States and the world. On that morning, 19 terrorists associated with the extremist group Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 commercial airplanes with the intent of carrying out coordinated attacks on prominent American targets. 2 planes, American Airlines Flight 11 and United Airlines Flight 175, were flown into the north and south towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. A 3rd plane, American Airlines Flight 77, crashed into the Pentagon, the headquarters of the U.S. Department of Defense, in Arlington, Virginia. The 4th plane, United Airlines Flight 93, was headed for another high-profile target, believed to be the U.S. Capitol or the White House, but passengers heroically fought back, causing the plane to crash in a field in Pennsylvania. The attacks caused catastrophic destruction and loss of life. The Twin Towers collapsed within hours of being struck, killing thousands of people, including firefighters, police officers, and first responders who rushed to the scene. In total, nearly 3,000 people from over 90 countries lost their lives, making it the deadliest terrorist attack in history. The events were broadcast live around the world, shocking and horrifying millions as the scale of the tragedy unfolded. The aftermath of the attacks had far-reaching consequences. In the immediate response, the United States declared a war on terror, leading to the invasion of Afghanistan to dismantle Al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban regime that harbored its leaders. Osama bin Laden, the mastermind behind the attacks, became the primary target of U.S. efforts, and his eventual killing in 2011 marked a significant milestone in the fight against terrorism. Domestically, the attacks led to the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, the implementation of the USA Patriot Act, and heightened security measures at airports and public spaces to prevent future incidents. The attacks also had profound social and cultural effects. They united Americans in grief and resolve, prompting acts of heroism, solidarity, and patriotism. At the same time, they fueled fear and suspicion, leading to increased scrutiny of Muslim and Middle Eastern communities and raising concerns about civil liberties. The global impact was equally significant, as countries around the world joined in efforts to combat terrorism, but the ensuing wars and policies also sparked debates over the balance between security and human rights. September 11th remains a somber day of remembrance, marked annually with ceremonies and memorials honoring the victims and heroes of that fateful day. The attacks reshaped U.S. foreign and domestic policy, altering the nation's sense of security and its role on the global stage. The legacy of 9/11 endures in the collective memory, serving as a reminder of the vulnerabilities of an interconnected world and the resilience of those who confront unimaginable challenges. The Louisiana Purchase, 1803. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 was a landmark event in American history that doubled the size of the United States and significantly influenced the nation's future. The acquisition involved the purchase of approximately 828,000 square miles of territory from France, extending from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains and from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border. This vast expanse of land, which would eventually form all or part of 15 U.S. states, transformed the United States into a continental power and opened up enormous opportunities for expansion and development. The purchase arose from a combination of circumstances that made the transaction possible. France, under the leadership of Napoleon Bonaparte, had initially acquired the Louisiana Territory from Spain with the intent of establishing a colonial empire in the Americas. However, France's ambitions were thwarted by various challenges, including the Haitian Revolution, which disrupted French plans in the Caribbean, and an impending war with Britain that placed significant strain on French resources. These pressures made Napoleon willing to sell the territory to raise funds for his military campaigns and to refocus on European affairs. For the United States, the acquisition was both a strategic and economic opportunity. President Thomas Jefferson, a strong proponent of westward expansion, sought to secure access to the Mississippi River and the vital port of New Orleans, which were critical for trade and transportation. Negotiations, initially aimed at purchasing only New Orleans and the surrounding area, quickly expanded when France offered to sell the entire Louisiana territory. Despite concerns about the constitutionality of such a large-scale purchase, Jefferson seized the chance, viewing it as essential to the nation's growth and security. The Louisiana purchase was completed for $15 million, a bargain that amounted to roughly 4 cents per acre. The transaction was met with widespread approval, although some Federalists criticized it as unnecessary or questioned the government's ability to govern such a vast and remote territory. Despite these objections, the purchase was ratified, and the land became part of the United States. The acquisition had profound and lasting impacts. It provided vast tracts of fertile land for agriculture, spurred westward migration, and laid the groundwork for the nation's expansion toward the Pacific Ocean. It also raised important questions about governance, Native American land rights, and the extension of slavery into new territories, issues that would shape American politics for decades. The Louisiana Purchase stands as one of the most significant achievements of Jefferson's presidency and a defining moment in the history of the United States. It exemplified the opportunities and challenges of territorial expansion and marked the beginning of a new era of growth, exploration, and ambition for the young nation. The Gold Rush, 1849. The Gold Rush of 1849 was a transformative event in American history that drew hundreds of thousands of people to California in pursuit of wealth and opportunity. It began in 1848 when gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill near Coloma, California, by James Marshall. News of the discovery spread rapidly, first throughout the region and then across the United States and the world, triggering a massive migration of prospectors and fortune seekers known as 49ers. The influx of people and the rapid economic development it spurred had profound social, economic, and environmental impacts. The promise of gold attracted people from all walks of life and from every corner of the globe. Farmers, laborers, merchants, and adventurers abandoned their homes and livelihoods to travel to California, often enduring arduous journeys by land or sea. Some traveled overland on the California Trail, braving harsh terrain, disease, and the risk of attacks, while others took long sea routes around Cape Horn or through the Isthmus of Panama. The diverse origins of the migrants made California a melting pot of cultures, with significant populations arriving from Latin America, Europe, China, and other parts of Asia. The Gold Rush brought rapid population growth and economic development to California. Boomtowns sprang up almost overnight, with San Francisco transforming from a small settlement into a bustling city. The mining industry dominated the economy, with prospectors using techniques such as panning, sluicing, and hydraulic mining to extract gold from rivers and hillsides. Merchants and entrepreneurs also profited, selling supplies, food, and services to miners. The surge in population and wealth contributed to California's swift transition to statehood in 1850. While the gold rush created immense opportunities, it also had significant negative consequences. Native American communities suffered greatly, as the influx of settlers led to the displacement of indigenous populations, the destruction of traditional lands, and violent conflicts. The environmental impact was severe, with rivers diverted, forests cleared, and landscapes irreparably altered by mining activities. The diverse population of miners and settlers brought cultural richness, but also racial tensions and discriminatory practices, particularly against Chinese immigrants, who faced prejudice and restrictive laws. The Gold Rush ultimately helped shape the identity and destiny of California and the United States. It accelerated westward expansion, contributed to the economic growth of the nation, and symbolized the spirit of ambition and opportunity that defined the American frontier. However, it also highlighted the complexities of rapid development, including issues of inequality, environmental degradation, and the treatment of marginalized communities. The legacy of the Gold Rush remains a powerful reminder of both the promise and the cost of the pursuit of wealth and progress. Prohibition era, 1920 to 1933. The Prohibition era, lasting from 1920 to 1933, was a period in American history marked by the nationwide ban on the production, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. Rooted in decades of activism by temperance movements, the prohibition of alcohol was seen as a way to curb social problems associated with drinking, such as crime, poverty, and family breakdown. The movement gained significant support from religious and social reform groups, particularly in rural areas, and culminated in the ratification of the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1919. The amendment was enforced by the Volstead Act, which provided the legal framework for implementing the ban. Prohibition initially garnered widespread support, as many believed it would lead to a healthier and more moral society. However, the reality of enforcing the ban proved far more complex and contentious. The demand for alcohol did not disappear. Instead, it gave rise to a vast illegal market. Speakeasies, clandestine bars operating in defiance of the law, proliferated, and bootlegging, the illegal production and distribution of alcohol, became a lucrative industry. Organized crime syndicates, most famously led by figures such as Al Capone, capitalized on the opportunity, using violence and corruption to dominate the illicit alcohol trade. The era was marked by widespread disregard for the law, as ordinary citizens and law enforcement officers alike often participated in or turned a blind eye to illegal activities. The difficulty of enforcing prohibition strained government resources, and the federal government faced increasing criticism for its inability to control the black market and the associated rise in crime. Moreover, public sentiment began to shift as the economic impact of the Great Depression took hold in the 1930s. Many saw the potential revenue from taxing alcohol as a solution to financial hardships and a way to reduce the federal budget deficit. The growing discontent with prohibition led to its repeal in 1933 with the ratification of the 21st Amendment, making it the only constitutional amendment to be overturned. The end of prohibition was celebrated by many, as it marked the return of a legal and regulated alcohol industry. However, the era left a lasting legacy, including the expansion of organized crime, the strengthening of federal law enforcement agencies, and ongoing debates about morality, individual rights, and the role of government in regulating personal behavior. The Prohibition era remains a significant chapter in American history, illustrating the complexities and unintended consequences of legislating morality. It highlighted the challenges of enforcing sweeping social reforms and the resilience of public demand in the face of legal restrictions. While its goals were rooted in ideals of societal improvement, the era ultimately underscored the difficulties of balancing reformist ambitions with practical governance and public sentiment. The New Deal, 1930s. The New Deal was a series of programs, policies, and reforms implemented in the 1930s by President Franklin D. Roosevelt to address the devastating effects of the Great Depression. By the time Roosevelt took office in 1933, the United States was in the depths of an economic crisis, with widespread unemployment, collapsing banks, and millions of families struggling to survive. The New Deal aimed to provide immediate relief to those suffering, spur economic recovery, and reform the financial system to prevent future crises. One of the New Deal's defining features was its ambitious scope, tackling problems across multiple sectors of the economy and society. Programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, and the Works Progress Administration, WPA, created millions of jobs, employing workers to build infrastructure, improve public lands, and support the arts. These initiatives not only provided a livelihood to struggling Americans, but also left a lasting legacy of public works that benefited communities for decades. The New Deal also sought to stabilize the financial system. To restore confidence in banks, the government enacted the Emergency Banking Act and created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, which guaranteed deposits. The Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, was established to regulate the stock market and curb speculative practices that had contributed to the 1929 crash. These measures were designed to bring greater transparency and accountability to the financial industry. reforms extended to agriculture and industry as well. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, aimed to raise crop prices by reducing overproduction, providing financial assistance to farmers in the process. Meanwhile, the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, encouraged industries to adopt fair labor standards, including minimum wages and maximum working hours. While some policies faced legal challenges and were struck down by the Supreme Court, they reflected the administration's commitment to addressing economic inequality and promoting labor rights. Social welfare was another cornerstone of the New Deal. The Social Security Act of 1935 established a safety net for the elderly, unemployed, and disabled, introducing pensions and unemployment insurance for the first time in U.S. history. This marked a fundamental shift in the relationship between the federal government and its citizens, as it assumed a more active role in ensuring economic security and well-being. While the New Deal faced criticism from various quarters, conservatives argued it expanded government power too far, while some liberals and progressives believed it did not go far enough. It fundamentally reshaped the United States. It helped to restore public confidence, mitigated the worst effects of the Great Depression, and laid the groundwork for a modern welfare state. The programs and reforms of the New Deal also transformed the Democratic Party into a coalition that would dominate American politics for much of the mid-20th century. The New Deal's legacy remains a topic of debate, but its impact on American society and government is undeniable. It provided hope and relief during one of the nation's darkest periods, redefined the role of government in the economy, and left a lasting imprint on the fabric of American life. Its initiatives demonstrated the potential of collective action in addressing widespread suffering and set a precedent for future responses to national crises. Women's suffrage and the 19th Amendment, 1920. The fight for women's suffrage in the United States was a long and arduous struggle that culminated in the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, granting women the right to vote. The movement began in earnest in the mid-19th century, with the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 marking a pivotal moment. At this gathering, activists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott declared that women deserved equal rights, including the right to participate in elections. This declaration sparked decades of advocacy, protest, and grassroots organizing to challenge deeply ingrained societal norms and legal barriers. In the decades that followed, suffragists employed a variety of strategies to advance their cause. Organizations such as the National Woman Suffrage Association, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and the American Woman Suffrage Association, headed by Lucy Stone, worked tirelessly to promote women's voting rights. These groups eventually merged into the National American Woman Suffrage Association, NAWSA, which became the primary force behind the movement. Suffragists lobbied legislators, organized rallies, and published writings to raise awareness of their cause. They faced significant opposition, with critics arguing that granting women the right to vote would disrupt traditional gender roles and undermine family structures. As the movement grew, suffragists employed increasingly bold tactics. In the early 20th century, leaders like Alice Paul and Lucy Burns formed the National Woman's Party, which adopted more militant methods, including picketing the White House and organizing hunger strikes. Their efforts, combined with the steady pressure from NAWSA and other advocates, helped to keep the issue at the forefront of national discourse. World War I further strengthened the case for women's suffrage, as women's contributions to the war effort highlighted their capabilities and underscored the injustice of denying them full citizenship rights. The turning point came in 1919 when Congress passed the 19th Amendment, stating that the right to vote could not be denied on the basis of sex. The amendment was ratified on August 18, 1920, after Tennessee became the 36th state to approve it, meeting the requirement for a 3/4 majority of the states. This landmark achievement enfranchised millions of women, fundamentally transforming American democracy and marking a major victory in the broader struggle for gender equality. The ratification of the 19th Amendment was a testament to the perseverance and dedication of generations of women who had fought for their rights in the face of overwhelming resistance. While it did not resolve all issues of inequality, particularly for women of color who continued to face barriers to voting, it represented a significant step toward greater inclusion and representation in the political process. The women's suffrage movement and the passage of the 19th Amendment remain powerful symbols of the fight for justice and the ongoing effort to achieve equality for all. Space race and moon landing, 1969. The space race was a defining aspect of the Cold War, a period of intense rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union that extended beyond politics and military power into the realm of scientific and technological achievement. Beginning in the late 1950s, this competition was fueled by the desire of both superpowers to demonstrate their superiority through space exploration, capturing the imagination of the world and pushing the boundaries of human knowledge and capability. The Soviet Union initially gained the upper hand by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, into orbit in 1957. This achievement shocked the United States and prompted significant investments in science and technology, including the establishment of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, in 1958. The Soviets continued to dominate the early years of the space race, sending the first human, Yuri Gagarin, into space in 1961, and achieving other milestones that underscored their technological prowess. In response, the United States committed itself to surpassing these achievements, with President John F. Kennedy famously declaring in 1961 that America would land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. This bold vision galvanized the nation and led to the Apollo program, a series of missions designed to develop the expertise and technology required for lunar exploration. The program faced significant challenges, including the tragic loss of 3 astronauts during a pre-flight test for Apollo 1 in 1967. Despite setbacks, NASA made rapid progress, achieving milestones such as the first manned orbit of the Moon during Apollo 8 in 1968. The culmination of the space race came on July 20, 1969, when Apollo 11 successfully landed on the Moon. Astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first humans to walk on the lunar surface, while Michael Collins piloted the command module in orbit above. Armstrong's words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," captured the significance of the moment. The mission was watched by millions around the world and represented not only a triumph for the United States, but a monumental achievement for humanity as a whole. The moon landing marked the peak of the space race and cemented America's position as the leader in space exploration. While the competition between the superpowers continued in other areas, the cooperative spirit that emerged in subsequent years, such as the joint Apollo-Soyuz mission in 1975, signaled a shift toward international collaboration in space. The space race and the moon landing had far-reaching implications. They spurred advances in science and technology, from rocketry to telecommunications, and inspired a generation of scientists, engineers, and dreamers. The legacy of this era continues to influence space exploration, reminding humanity of what can be achieved through vision, determination, and a willingness to push beyond perceived limits. The moon landing remains one of the most iconic moments in history, symbolizing human ingenuity and the boundless potential of exploration. Japanese-American internment during World War II. During World War II, Japanese-American internment was a tragic and unjust chapter in United States history, marked by the forced relocation and incarceration of thousands of people of Japanese descent. This action, rooted in fear and racial prejudice, began shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor by Japan on December 7, 1941, which thrust the United States into the war. The attack heightened anti-Japanese sentiment across the country and led to widespread suspicion of Japanese Americans, fueled by baseless claims that they might act as spies or saboteurs for Japan. In February 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the military to designate exclusion zones and remove individuals deemed a threat to national security. Although the order did not explicitly mention Japanese Americans, It was used to target over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, two-thirds of whom were US citizens. These individuals were forced to leave their homes, businesses, and possessions behind as they were relocated to internment camps in remote areas of the country. The internment camps, often referred to as relocation centers, were located in desolate regions such as deserts and swamps, with harsh living conditions. Families lived in cramped barracks surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by armed soldiers. Despite the adversity, internees sought to create a sense of normalcy by building schools, organizing activities, and forming communities within the camps. However, the loss of freedom, property, and livelihoods inflicted deep emotional and financial harm. The policy faced criticism from some quarters, but it was upheld by the Supreme Court in cases like Korematsu versus United States, 1944, which controversially ruled that the internment was justified by wartime necessity. It was only years later that this decision was widely condemned as a violation of civil liberties. Japanese Americans began to be released from the camps in 1944, and the exclusion order was formally rescinded in 1945. Many internees returned to find their homes and businesses destroyed or stolen, forcing them to rebuild their lives from scratch. The experience left lasting scars on those who endured it and highlighted the vulnerability of civil rights during times of crisis. In the decades following the war, efforts were made to acknowledge and redress this injustice. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which formally apologized for the internment and provided financial compensation to surviving internees. This act recognized that the internment was not based on military necessity, but on racial prejudice and wartime hysteria. Japanese American internment remains a powerful reminder of the consequences of fear and discrimination, serving as a cautionary tale about the fragility of civil liberties in the face of national security concerns. It underscores the importance of vigilance in protecting the rights of all individuals, even during times of conflict and uncertainty. Bacon's Rebellion, 1676. Bacon's Rebellion, which occurred in 1676 in the Virginia colony, was a significant uprising that exposed the growing tensions between settlers and colonial authorities, as well as deep-seated divisions in colonial society. The rebellion was led by Nathaniel Bacon, a young and ambitious planter, against the administration of Governor William Berkeley. The conflict stemmed from a combination of grievances, including disputes over land, Native American policy, and political inequality. During the late 17th century, Virginia was experiencing rapid population growth, which put increasing pressure on available land for settlement and cultivation. Wealthy landowners controlled most of the prime land along the coast, forcing poorer settlers, many of whom were former indentured servants, to move westward into territories inhabited by Native Americans. These settlers frequently clashed with indigenous groups, leading to violence and instability. They resented Governor Berkeley's policies, which they saw as favoring the interests of the wealthy elite and prioritizing trade relationships with Native Americans over the safety and land needs of frontier settlers. The immediate trigger for the rebellion was Berkeley's refusal to authorize a military campaign against Native American tribes following a series of attacks on frontier settlements. Bacon, defying the governor, organized an unauthorized militia composed of disgruntled settlers and indentured servants, attacking both hostile and friendly Native American groups. His actions escalated the conflict, drawing condemnation from Berkeley, who declared Bacon a rebel. In response, Bacon turned his forces against the colonial government, accusing Berkeley of corruption and mismanagement. The rebellion reached its climax when Bacon and his followers marched on Jamestown, the colonial capital, and burned it to the ground. For several months, the colony was in turmoil as Bacon's forces clashed with Berkeley's loyalists. However, the rebellion unraveled after Bacon's sudden death from illness in October 1676. Without their leader, the insurgents were quickly defeated, and Berkeley regained control, punishing the rebels with executions and confiscations. Although Bacon's rebellion was short-lived, its consequences were far-reaching. The revolt exposed deep divisions within colonial society, particularly between wealthy planters and poorer settlers, as well as tensions over relations with Native Americans. It also highlighted the fragility of colonial authority and the challenges of governing a diverse and expanding population. In the aftermath of the rebellion, colonial leaders took steps to address some of the underlying causes of unrest. They reduced reliance on indentured servitude, which had contributed to the growing class tensions, and increased the importation of enslaved Africans, entrenching racial slavery as a cornerstone of the colonial economy. This shift in labor practices would have profound and lasting implications for the development of the American South. Bacon's rebellion remains a complex and controversial episode in American history, reflecting the interplay of economic inequality, political disenfranchisement, and racial dynamics. It serves as an early example of popular resistance against perceived injustice, as well as a turning point in the evolution of colonial society and the institution of slavery. Shays' Rebellion, 1786 to 1787. Shays' Rebellion, which took place from 1786 to 1787 in western Massachusetts, was an armed uprising that revealed the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation and underscored the need for a stronger national government. The rebellion was led by Daniel Shays, a former Revolutionary War captain, and was driven by economic hardship, political disenfranchisement, and anger over government policies that disproportionately burdened struggling farmers. In the years following the American Revolution, the United States faced significant economic challenges. War debts, inflation, and a post-war recession left many farmers in Massachusetts unable to pay their taxes or repay debts. The state government, dominated by wealthy merchants and creditors, enforced harsh policies, including high taxes and aggressive debt collection practices, which often led to the foreclosure of farms and imprisonment of debtors. These policies created widespread resentment among small farmers, many of whom were Revolutionary War veterans who felt betrayed by the government they had fought to establish. The situation reached a breaking point in late 1786 when groups of armed farmers began organizing to prevent courts from convening, effectively halting foreclosures and debt proceedings. Daniel Shays emerged as a leader of the movement, which aimed to demand economic relief and reforms, including the issuance of paper currency, lower taxes, and a moratorium on debt collection. The rebels, known as Shaysites, marched on courthouses and clashed with state militia forces, escalating tensions. The rebellion culminated in January 1787 with an attempted assault on the federal arsenal at Springfield, Massachusetts. The goal was to seize weapons and strengthen their position, but the attack was repelled by a militia force funded by wealthy Boston merchants. The defeat at Springfield marked the beginning of the rebellion's decline, and within months, the insurgents were dispersed or captured. Although some leaders, including Shays, fled the state, the rebellion prompted Massachusetts to adopt more lenient policies toward debtors to prevent further unrest. Shays' rebellion had significant political consequences that extended far beyond Massachusetts. It exposed the inability of the federal government under the Articles of Confederation to maintain order or address economic grievances effectively. The national government lacked the power to raise troops, levy taxes, or regulate commerce, leaving it unable to intervene or support Massachusetts during the crisis. The rebellion alarmed political leaders across the fledgling United States, fueling fears of widespread anarchy and the potential collapse of the Union. The rebellion became a catalyst for the Constitutional Convention of 1787, where delegates met to address the shortcomings of the Articles of Confederation. The resulting U.S. Constitution established a stronger central government with the power to enforce laws, regulate the economy, and maintain national security. Shays' rebellion thus played a crucial role in shaping the nation's political framework and ensuring its long-term stability. While the rebellion was ultimately suppressed, it highlighted the deep economic and social divisions in post-revolutionary America and underscored the importance of balancing the interests of different social classes in a democratic system. It remains a poignant reminder of the challenges of governance and the struggles of ordinary citizens to secure justice and fairness in the face of systemic inequality. The XYZ Affair, 1797 to 1798. The XYZ Affair, which unfolded between 1797 and 1798, was a diplomatic controversy between the United States and France that heightened tensions and nearly led to war. The incident occurred during the presidency of John Adams and reflected the challenges faced by the young nation as it sought to navigate complex international relations in a world dominated by European powers. At the time, relations between the United States and France were deteriorating. The French government, angered by the United States signing of the Jay Treaty with Britain in 1794, viewed it as a betrayal of their alliance during the American Revolution. In retaliation, French privateers began seizing American ships engaged in trade with Britain. To resolve the crisis, President Adams sent a diplomatic delegation to Paris in 1797, hoping to negotiate a settlement and restore peaceful relations. The American envoys, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, John Marshall, and Elbridge Gerry, were met not by French officials but by three intermediaries later referred to as X, Y, and Z in official reports. These intermediaries demanded bribes and loans as preconditions for negotiations, including a substantial payment to French Foreign Minister Charles Maurice de Talleyrand. The demands were seen as both insulting and extortionate, prompting the American diplomats to refuse and return home. When the details of the affair became public in 1798, it sparked outrage across the United States. The revelation that France had sought bribes and treated American diplomats with such disrespect unified much of the country against the French. The phrase "millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute" became a rallying cry, encapsulating the public's refusal to submit to foreign coercion. The fallout from the XYZ affair had significant consequences. It led to an undeclared naval conflict between the United States and France known as the Quasi-War, fought primarily in the Caribbean. The U.S. government began to strengthen its military, establishing the Department of the Navy and building warships to protect its commerce. Domestically, the affair deepened political divisions, with the pro-British Federalist Party using the crisis to justify their policies of strengthening the central government and military. Meanwhile, the Democratic Republican Party, which had been sympathetic to France, found itself on the defensive. The crisis eventually subsided when Adams pursued a second round of diplomacy, resulting in the Convention of 1800, which ended the Quasi-War and restored peace. While the XYZ affair did not lead to a full-scale war, it had lasting effects on American foreign policy and domestic politics. It underscored the challenges of maintaining neutrality in an era of global conflict and highlighted the vulnerability of the United States in its early years. The XYZ affair remains a significant episode in American history, illustrating the complexities of diplomacy and the importance of national unity in the face of external threats. It also reinforced the young republic's determination to assert its sovereignty and dignity on the world stage, setting a precedent for its future interactions with foreign powers. The War of 1812 and the Burning of Washington, 1814. The War of 1812, fought between the United States and Great Britain from 1812 to 1815, was a conflict rooted in unresolved tensions from the American Revolution and new disputes over trade, territory, and national sovereignty. One of the key causes of the war was Britain's policy of impressment, in which American sailors were forcibly taken into service for the British Navy. Additionally, British restrictions on American trade with France during the Napoleonic Wars, combined with British support for Native American resistance against American westward expansion, fueled resentment in the United States. The war was marked by a series of battles on land and sea, as well as attempts by both sides to control key territories and trade routes. For the United States, the conflict was an opportunity to assert its independence and protect its interests, while for Britain, it was a secondary theater in the larger struggle against Napoleon in Europe. Early American campaigns, such as invasions of Canada, were largely unsuccessful, but the war saw significant naval victories, including battles won by the USS Constitution and privateers that disrupted British shipping. One of the most dramatic and symbolic events of the war occurred in 1814, when British forces captured Washington, D.C., and burned several public buildings, including the Capitol and the White House. The attack was part of a broader British campaign following their victory over Napoleon, which allowed them to focus more resources on the American conflict. In August 1814, British troops, led by Major General Robert Ross, defeated American forces at the Battle of Bladensburg, leaving Washington vulnerable. The British entered the city on August 24 and set fire to key government buildings as retaliation for the American destruction of York, modern-day Toronto, in 1813. The burning of Washington shocked and humiliated Americans, but it also galvanized resistance. First Lady Dolly Madison famously saved a portrait of George Washington and other valuables from the White House before fleeing, becoming a symbol of resilience. Despite the destruction, the British occupation of Washington was brief, and their forces soon withdrew after encountering logistical challenges and stiffened American resistance. The war continued with significant battles, including the defense of Baltimore at Fort McHenry, which inspired Francis Scott Key to write The Star-Spangled Banner. The conflict reached its conclusion with the Treaty of Ghent, signed in December 1814, though news of the treaty did not reach the United States until after the Battle of New Orleans in January 1815, a decisive American victory led by General Andrew Jackson. Although the War of 1812 ended in a stalemate, with neither side gaining significant territorial concessions, it had important consequences for the United States. The war bolstered national pride, fostered a sense of unity, and affirmed the country's independence from British influence. It also weakened Native American resistance in the Northwest Territory and encouraged American expansion. The burning of Washington, while a painful episode, became a rallying point for the young nation, symbolizing its ability to endure adversity and emerge stronger in the face of challenges. Trail of Tears and Indian Removal Act, 1830s. The Trail of Tears and the Indian Removal Act of the 1830s represent one of the darkest chapters in American history, marked by the forced displacement and suffering of Native American tribes. The Indian Removal Act, signed into law by President Andrew Jackson in 1830, authorized the federal government to negotiate treaties with Native American tribes to relocate them from their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States to territory west of the Mississippi River. Jackson and his supporters argued that this policy would resolve conflicts between settlers and Native Americans, open land for white expansion, and protect Native peoples from the encroachment of American civilization. In reality, it was a policy rooted in racism and a desire for economic gain. The implementation of the Indian Removal Act led to the displacement of tens of thousands of Native Americans, including the Cherokee, Muskogee, Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw tribes. Despite some resistance, most tribes were coerced into signing treaties under pressure or threat of military action. The Cherokee Nation, in particular, resisted removal through legal means, challenging the policy in the U.S. Supreme Court. In the case of Worcester versus Georgia, 1832, the court ruled in favor of the Cherokee, stating that they were a sovereign nation and that Georgia's attempts to impose its laws on Cherokee territory were unconstitutional. However, Jackson ignored the ruling, famously stating, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." The forced relocations became known as the Trail of Tears, a term that underscores the immense suffering endured by the displaced tribes. Between 1830 and 1850, thousands of Native Americans were forcibly removed from their homelands and marched hundreds of miles to designated Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. The journeys were grueling, conducted under harsh conditions with inadequate supplies of food, clothing, and medical care. Many perished from disease, starvation, and exposure along the way. It is estimated that approximately 4,000 Cherokee alone died during their forced march, representing a devastating loss for the tribe. The Trail of Tears was not merely a humanitarian tragedy, but also a profound act of cultural destruction. The removal severed Native Americans from their ancestral lands, sacred sites, and traditional ways of life, disrupting their communities and leaving lasting scars on their identity and heritage. The lands they were relocated to were often less fertile and more difficult to cultivate, further compounding their hardships. The Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears remain deeply controversial and widely condemned as a violation of human rights. They exemplify the United States' broader history of marginalizing and oppressing Native American peoples in the pursuit of territorial and economic expansion. This period serves as a stark reminder of the consequences of policies driven by greed and prejudice, as well as the resilience of Native American tribes in the face of systemic injustice and cultural erasure. Today, the Trail of Tears is remembered as a somber and critical part of American history, underscoring the need for reflection, accountability, and a commitment to justice for indigenous peoples. Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, 1932 to 1972. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, conducted between 1932 and 1972, was a profoundly unethical study carried out by the U.S. Public Health Service, PHS, in collaboration with the Tuskegee Institute. The study aimed to observe the natural progression of untreated syphilis in African American men under the guise of providing free medical care. It stands as a glaring example of systemic racism and medical malpractice in American history, with far-reaching implications for public trust in healthcare systems. The study began in Macon County, Alabama, targeting a group of 600 African American men, 399 of whom had syphilis and 201 who did not. The participants, mostly poor sharecroppers, were misled into believing they were receiving treatment for bad blood, a term that encompassed various ailments. In reality, no effective treatment was provided, even after penicillin became the standard cure for syphilis in the 1940s. Instead, the researchers deliberately withheld treatment to observe the long-term effects of the disease on the human body. The men were subjected to regular medical examinations and procedures, but were never informed of their diagnosis or the true purpose of the study. They were also denied access to information about available treatments, which could have saved their lives and prevented the disease from being transmitted to others. Many suffered severe health complications, including blindness, mental illness, and death, as a result of untreated syphilis. Their families also bore the burden, with some wives and children contracting the disease. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment continued for 4 decades, during which time multiple opportunities to end the study were ignored. Public health officials justified their actions by claiming the study would provide valuable data, but the research was conducted without the informed consent of the participants, violating fundamental ethical standards. The study was finally exposed in 1972 when a whistleblower alerted the media, prompting public outrage and leading to its termination. The fallout from the Tuskegee experiment was significant. In 1973, a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of the victims, resulting in a settlement that included financial compensation and the establishment of free medical care for survivors and their families. In 1997, President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology on behalf of the United States government, acknowledging the profound harm caused by the study and the deep mistrust it sowed in the African American community toward the medical establishment. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment left a lasting scar on the history of medical ethics, highlighting the dangers of racial bias and exploitation in scientific research. It prompted significant changes in research practices, including the development of stricter ethical guidelines, the requirement for informed consent, and the establishment of institutional review boards, IRBs, to oversee human studies. The legacy of the experiment continues to influence discussions about health equity, systemic racism, and the importance of restoring trust in healthcare institutions. It serves as a sobering reminder of the need for vigilance in protecting the dignity and rights of all individuals in medical research. The Gilded Age Political Corruption. The Gilded Age, spanning roughly from the 1870s to the early 1900s, was a period of rapid industrialization, economic growth, and urbanization in the United States. Beneath the surface of prosperity and technological innovation, however, lay widespread political corruption that pervaded local, state, and federal governments. This corruption was characterized by the dominance of political machines, the influence of corporate interests, and a lack of accountability among elected officials. Political machines, most notably Tammany Hall in New York City, wielded immense power during the Gilded Age. These organizations operated by controlling votes, manipulating elections, and providing patronage to their supporters. Leaders like William Boss Tweed of Tammany Hall exemplified the corrupt practices of the era, using their positions to embezzle public funds and engage in bribery. Tweed and his associates stole millions of dollars from the city through inflated contracts, kickbacks, and fraudulent schemes, all while maintaining control over local politics by delivering services and favors to immigrant communities in exchange for votes. At the federal level, corruption was equally pervasive. The influence of wealthy industrialists and business magnates, often referred to as robber barons, shaped legislation and public policy to favor corporate interests. Through practices such as lobbying, campaign contributions, and outright bribery, these powerful figures secured government contracts, favorable tariffs, and monopolistic protections. The credit mobilier scandal of the early 1870s exemplified this dynamic, as executives of a construction company involved in building the Union Pacific Railroad created a fraudulent scheme to siphon off profits while bribing members of Congress to cover it up. The spoils system, which awarded government jobs based on political loyalty rather than merit, further entrenched corruption during this era. Political appointees often lacked qualifications and used their positions to enrich themselves rather than serve the public. This practice led to inefficiency and graft, as government resources were misused or squandered. The assassination of President James Abe Garfield in 1881 by a disgruntled office seeker underscored the dangers of this system and prompted calls for reform. Efforts to combat corruption during the Gilded Age were sporadic but significant. The Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act of 1883 marked a turning point by introducing merit-based hiring for federal jobs and reducing the influence of patronage. Investigative journalism, often referred to as muckraking, exposed the excesses of political machines and corporate monopolies, rallying public support for change. Figures like Thomas Nast used political cartoons to critique corruption and raise awareness of the abuses of power. Despite these reforms, the Gilded Age left a legacy of skepticism toward government and an enduring awareness of the dangers posed by unchecked power and greed. The era highlighted the need for greater transparency, accountability, and civic engagement to ensure that public institutions serve the common good. While the period was marked by immense economic progress, it also revealed the deep flaws in a system that prioritized wealth and influence over democratic ideals. The Zoot Suit Riots, 1943. The Zoot Suit Riots of 1943 were a series of violent clashes in Los Angeles that highlighted deep racial tensions and social inequalities in the United States during World War II. The riots primarily involved Mexican-American youth who were identifiable by their distinctive zoot suits, long, oversized jackets paired with high-waisted, baggy trousers, and white servicemen stationed in the area. These events were fueled by racial prejudice, wartime anxieties, and a broader climate of discrimination against minority communities. During the early 1940s, Los Angeles had a large Mexican-American population, many of whom lived in segregated neighborhoods and faced systemic racism in housing, employment, and education. The zoot suit, popular among young Mexican-Americans, became a cultural symbol of rebellion and pride, but was viewed by many white Americans as unpatriotic and wasteful during a time of wartime rationing. This tension was exacerbated by media portrayals that depicted zoot suit-wearing youth, often referred to as pachucos, as gang members and delinquents. The immediate precursor to the riots was the killing of Jose Diaz in what became known as the Sleepy Lagoon case in 1942. A group of young Mexican Americans was accused of his murder, and the subsequent trial was marked by blatant prejudice and lack of evidence. This case inflamed anti-Mexican sentiment and painted Mexican-American youth as inherently criminal in the public eye. In June 1943, tensions erupted into violence when groups of white servicemen began targeting zoot suit-wearing Mexican-American youth in downtown Los Angeles. What began as isolated attacks quickly escalated into widespread unrest, with servicemen roaming the streets, stripping zoot suits off their victims, and assaulting them. The violence extended to other minority groups, including African Americans and Filipino Americans, as mobs attacked anyone they deemed as non-conforming or threatening. Law enforcement largely sided with the servicemen, arresting Mexican-American youth instead of the attackers and failing to intervene to stop the violence. The riots lasted for about a week, ending only after military officials intervened and restricted servicemen from entering Los Angeles. Despite the cessation of violence, the aftermath of the riots left a lasting impact on Mexican-American communities, deepening their sense of alienation and mistrust toward law enforcement and government institutions. The riots also exposed broader societal tensions, including the ways in which wartime patriotism was used to justify racial discrimination and the scapegoating of minority communities. The Zoot Suit riots remain a significant event in American history, symbolizing the intersection of race, culture, and identity during a period of social upheaval. They serve as a reminder of the challenges faced by minority groups in asserting their place in a society that often marginalized them, and the resilience of those communities in preserving their cultural identity in the face of adversity. The riots also underscore the importance of confronting prejudice and promoting justice to prevent such incidents of racial violence from recurring. Coxey's Army March, 1894. Coxey's Army was a protest march that took place in 1894, during one of the most severe economic downturns in American history, the Panic of 1893. Organized by Jacob Coxey, a businessman and reformer from Ohio, the march was a response to widespread unemployment and financial hardship caused by the economic depression. It became one of the first significant demonstrations of its kind in the United States, bringing attention to the plight of workers and the growing demand for government intervention in the economy. The Panic of 1893 had devastating effects, with banks failing, businesses closing, and millions of Americans losing their jobs. Coxey believed that the federal government should take action to alleviate the suffering by implementing a public works program. His proposal involved issuing paper currency to fund infrastructure projects such as road construction, which would create jobs for the unemployed while improving the nation's transportation system. However, this idea was considered radical at the time, as the government had traditionally taken a hands-off approach to economic issues. Coxey decided to bring his demands directly to Washington, D.C., by organizing a march of unemployed workers. Dubbed Coxey's Army, the group set out from Massillon, Ohio, in March 1894, gaining national attention as it traveled across the country. The marchers were met with a mix of support and hostility, reflecting the divided opinions about their cause. Many sympathized with the plight of the unemployed, while others, including politicians and business leaders, dismissed the march as a dangerous and subversive act. By the time Coxey's Army reached Washington in late April, it had grown to several hundred participants. On May 1, 1894, the group attempted to hold a peaceful demonstration on the steps of the U.S. Capitol to present their demands. However, they were met with resistance from law enforcement. Coxey and several other leaders were arrested for trespassing on the Capitol grounds, and the protest was dispersed without any substantive action being taken on their proposals. Although Coxey's Army did not achieve its immediate goals, the march was significant for several reasons. It highlighted the desperate conditions faced by the unemployed and the growing dissatisfaction with the government's laissez-faire policies. It also marked a turning point in American protest movements, as it was one of the first large-scale demonstrations to focus on economic justice and the rights of workers. The event inspired future labor and social justice movements, laying the groundwork for increased public pressure on the government to address issues of poverty and inequality. The legacy of Coxey's Army is a reminder of the power of grassroots activism to bring attention to social and economic issues. While it did not lead to immediate change, the march underscored the need for government responsibility in addressing unemployment and set a precedent for future efforts to demand reforms in the face of economic crises. The Palmer Raids and Red Scare, 1919 to 1920. The Palmer Raids and the Red Scare of 1919 to 1920 were a period of intense fear and repression in the United States, driven by concerns over communism, anarchism, and radical political movements. This wave of anti-radical sentiment emerged in the aftermath of World War I, during a time of significant social and economic upheaval. The war's end brought widespread labor strikes, inflation, and a growing sense of insecurity, which combined with the Russian Revolution of 1917 to stoke fears of a communist conspiracy threatening American democracy. The Red Scare was fueled by a series of events that heightened public anxiety. Bombings in 1919, including an attempted attack on U.S. Attorney General Abe Mitchell Palmer's home, were attributed to anarchist groups, although definitive links to any organized conspiracy were never established. These incidents, along with growing labor unrest and the activities of leftist organizations, created a climate of suspicion and led many to believe that radicals were plotting to overthrow the government. In response, Attorney General Palmer initiated a campaign to root out alleged subversives and radicals. This effort, known as the Palmer Raids, involved mass arrests, deportations, and surveillance targeting immigrants, labor organizers, and members of socialist and anarchist groups. Under the direction of J. Edgar Hoover, who led the newly formed General Intelligence Division of the Justice Department, thousands of individuals were rounded up in raids across the country, often without warrants or due process. Many of those arrested were detained on flimsy evidence, and some were deported without fair hearings. The raids disproportionately targeted immigrants, who were viewed with suspicion and accused of bringing radical ideologies to the United States. The Palmer Raids were widely publicized and initially supported by much of the public and the press, who saw them as a necessary measure to protect the nation from internal threats. However, criticism began to mount as the excesses of the raids became apparent. Reports of mistreatment, illegal detentions, and the violation of civil liberties eroded public confidence in Palmer's campaign. Prominent figures, including members of Congress and the legal community, questioned the legitimacy of the raids and the broader Red Scare, pointing out that the vast majority of those targeted posed no real threat. The hysteria of the Red Scare began to subside by the early 1920s as the feared communist uprising failed to materialize and public opinion shifted. Palmer's predictions of a violent May Day revolution in 1920, which never occurred, further discredited his efforts and marked the decline of his political career. The Red Scare, however, left a lasting impact on American society and politics, shaping attitudes toward immigrants, labor movements, and dissent for years to come. The Palmer Raids and the Red Scare serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of fear-driven policies and the erosion of civil liberties in times of crisis. They illustrate how societal anxieties can be exploited to justify government overreach and the suppression of dissent, with lasting consequences for those who are unfairly targeted. This period remains a stark reminder of the importance of safeguarding democratic principles, even in the face of perceived threats. The Bonus Army Protest, 1932. The Bonus Army Protest of 1932 was a significant and poignant event during the Great Depression, highlighting the struggles of World War I veterans and the government's inability to address the economic hardships faced by many Americans. The protest centered on a group of veterans who demanded the early payment of a bonus promised to them for their wartime service, as economic conditions left them unemployed and destitute. In 1924, Congress had passed the World War Adjusted Compensation Act, which promised a cash bonus to veterans who had served during the war. However, the payments were not scheduled to be distributed until 1945. By the early 1930s, the Great Depression had devastated the American economy, leaving millions unemployed, including many veterans who desperately needed financial relief. As conditions worsened, demands grew for Congress to authorize the immediate payment of the bonuses. In the spring of 1932, thousands of veterans and their families, known collectively as the Bonus Expeditionary Force or Bonus Army, marched to Washington, D.C. to press their case. They established a sprawling encampment on the Anacostia Flats, a muddy area near the Capitol, where they lived in makeshift shelters while lobbying Congress. The protest was peaceful and well organized, and the veterans' plight garnered public sympathy as they sought to call attention to their economic struggles and the government's unfulfilled promises. Despite their efforts, Congress refused to pass legislation authorizing the early payment of the bonuses. President Herbert Hoover, wary of increasing federal expenditures during the economic crisis, opposed the measure. Tensions escalated in late July when Hoover ordered the eviction of the Bonus Army from federal property. When the veterans refused to leave, the government deployed the U.S. Army under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, with Major Dwight D. Eisenhower and Major George S. Patton serving under him. The eviction turned violent as troops used tear gas, cavalry, and tanks to disperse the protesters. The encampments were set on fire, and several people were injured, with at least one infant reportedly dying as a result of the conflict. The harsh response shocked the nation and deepened public discontent with the Hoover administration, which was already seen as failing to address the broader economic crisis. The Bonus Army protest left a lasting impact on American politics and public consciousness. It underscored the desperation and frustration of the Great Depression era and the failure of the government to meet the needs of its most vulnerable citizens. The violent suppression of the protest further tarnished Hoover's reputation and contributed to his defeat in the 1932 presidential election, paving the way for Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal. In 1936, Congress finally passed legislation granting the early payment of the bonuses, overriding a veto by Roosevelt. The Bonus Army's struggle remains a powerful symbol of the challenges faced by veterans and the importance of addressing their needs, as well as a reminder of the human cost of economic inequality and governmental inaction during times of crisis. The Black Codes and Reconstruction Policies, 1865 to 1877. The Black Codes and Reconstruction Policies from 1865 to 1877 represent a critical period in American history, marked by the struggle to define the rights and freedoms of newly emancipated African Americans in the aftermath of the Civil War. Following the Union victory and the abolition of slavery through the 13th Amendment, Southern states implemented the Black Codes as an attempt to maintain racial hierarchies and control over African Americans. These laws, enacted in 1865 and 1866, severely restricted the freedoms of black people, aiming to limit their economic opportunities, enforce labor contracts, and perpetuate white supremacy. The Black Codes varied from state to state, but shared common features. They imposed strict vagrancy laws, requiring African Americans to show proof of employment or risk being arrested and forced into labor contracts resembling slavery. Other provisions restricted land ownership, prohibited interracial marriage, and limited access to education. The codes aimed to restore the plantation economy by ensuring a dependent black labor force while denying African Americans the rights and protections afforded to white citizens. The implementation of the Black Codes provoked widespread outrage in the North and underscored the inadequacy of President Andrew Johnson's lenient approach to Reconstruction. Johnson's policies allowed Southern states to re-enter the Union with minimal conditions, granting them the autonomy to enact these oppressive laws. In response, the radical Republicans in Congress pushed for a more aggressive Reconstruction agenda to protect the rights of African Americans and rebuild the South on the principles of equality and justice. The radical Reconstruction policies that followed sought to address the injustices of the Black Codes and secure civil rights for African Americans. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 declared African Americans to be citizens and granted them equal protection under the law. This was followed by the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed citizenship and equal rights, and the 15th Amendment, which prohibited racial discrimination in voting. To enforce these changes, Congress placed Southern states under military rule through the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, requiring them to draft new constitutions and ensure voting rights for African American men before rejoining the Union. During this period, African Americans made significant political and social advancements. Black men were elected to local, state, and federal offices, and the Freedmen's Bureau was established to provide assistance, including education, legal support, and employment opportunities. However, these gains were met with fierce resistance from white supremacists who sought to undermine Reconstruction through violence and intimidation. Organizations like the Ku Klux Klan emerged to terrorize African Americans and their allies, while white-dominated governments enacted policies to suppress black political participation. By the end of Reconstruction in 1877, the federal government's commitment to protecting African American rights waned. The withdrawal of federal troops from the South, coupled with the rise of white-dominated Redeemer governments, allowed the systematic dismantling of Reconstruction policies. The Black Codes evolved into Jim Crow laws, institutionalizing segregation and disenfranchisement for decades to come. The Black Codes and Reconstruction policies represent a complex and pivotal chapter in American history. While Reconstruction achieved important constitutional and legislative milestones, the enduring legacy of the Black Codes and the eventual failure to sustain Reconstruction's promises highlight the persistent struggle for racial equality and justice in the United States. This period serves as a reminder of both the potential for progress and the challenges of achieving lasting social and political change. The Haitian Revolution's impact on the Louisiana Purchase. The Haitian Revolution, which took place from 1791 to 1804, played a crucial role in shaping the circumstances that led to the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. This successful slave revolt in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, not only disrupted France's colonial ambitions in the Americas, but also created conditions that prompted Napoleon Bonaparte to sell the vast Louisiana territory to the United States. Saint-Domingue was France's most lucrative colony, producing immense wealth through its sugar and coffee plantations, which were sustained by the labor of enslaved Africans. The Haitian Revolution began as a slave uprising, led by figures like Toussaint Louverture, and eventually evolved into a broader fight for independence. Over the course of more than a decade, enslaved people and free people of color waged a relentless struggle against French, Spanish, and British forces, ultimately defeating Napoleon's army and declaring independence in 1804. Haiti became the first independent black-led nation in the Western Hemisphere and the first nation to abolish slavery entirely. The revolution profoundly affected France's ability to maintain its empire in the Americas. Napoleon, who had envisioned using Saint-Domingue as a strategic base to expand French influence in the New World, faced enormous losses during the conflict. The French military campaign to retake the colony was costly in both lives and resources, with thousands of soldiers succumbing to combat and disease, particularly yellow fever. The failure to regain control of Saint-Domingue shattered Napoleon's plans for a French empire in the Americas and left him financially strained and politically constrained. Without Saint-Domingue, the Louisiana Territory, which France had reacquired from Spain in 1800, became less strategically important to Napoleon. Initially, he intended to use the fertile lands of Louisiana to supply food and raw materials to the Caribbean colony, but the loss of Saint-Domingue rendered this plan obsolete. Additionally, France faced growing pressure in Europe, including the looming threat of war with Britain. Napoleon needed funds to support his military ambitions on the continent, and saw the sale of Louisiana as an opportunity to strengthen France while weakening Britain's rival, the United States. For the United States, the Louisiana Purchase was a transformative event. President Thomas Jefferson seized the chance to acquire the vast territory, which doubled the size of the nation, for $15 million. This acquisition secured control of the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans, critical for trade and westward expansion. However, the purchase was only made possible because of France's diminished presence in the Americas, a direct consequence of the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution's impact on the Louisiana Purchase underscores its broader significance in reshaping the geopolitical landscape of the Americas. By undermining France's colonial power, it facilitated one of the largest land acquisitions in U.S. history, altering the trajectory of the young republic. The revolution also highlighted the interconnectedness of struggles for freedom and the profound influence of events in one part of the world on developments in another. While Haiti's fight for independence inspired enslaved and oppressed people globally, its ripple effects helped define the territorial and political contours of the United States. The Ludlow Massacre, 1914. The Ludlow Massacre of 1914 was a violent and tragic event in the history of labor struggles in the United States, highlighting the brutal clashes between coal miners and the powerful corporations that controlled the industry. It occurred during a strike by coal miners in southern Colorado, who were fighting for better wages, safer working conditions, and the right to unionize. The strike was part of a broader labor movement in the early 20th century, during which workers sought to challenge the exploitative practices of industrial giants. The miners, many of whom were immigrants from southern and eastern Europe, worked under harsh and dangerous conditions in company-owned towns where every aspect of their lives was controlled by the mining companies. They lived in company-owned housing, shopped at company stores, and were often paid in scrip, a form of currency that could only be used within the company's ecosystem. These arrangements left workers with little autonomy and trapped in cycles of debt. In 1913, the United Mine Workers of America, UMWA, organized a strike against the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, owned by the Rockefeller family and other coal operators. The miners demanded recognition of their union, an 8-hour workday, fair pay, and improved safety standards. In retaliation, the companies evicted striking miners and their families from company housing, forcing them to establish tent colonies near the mines. Tensions escalated as the mining companies hired private guards and state militia to suppress the strike. These forces frequently clashed with the miners, using intimidation, violence, and sabotage to break the strike. The situation reached a breaking point on April 20, 1914, when members of the Colorado National Guard and company-hired guards attacked the largest tent colony near Ludlow. Armed with rifles and a machine gun, they fired on the strikers and their families for hours, setting fire to the tents in the chaos. The violence resulted in the deaths of over 20 people, including women and children who were trapped in a pit beneath one of the burning tents. The massacre shocked the nation and drew widespread condemnation, but it also ignited further violence as enraged miners launched a series of retaliatory attacks, leading to weeks of bloody confrontations across the Colorado coalfields. The Ludlow Massacre became a rallying point for the labor movement, symbolizing the extreme measures corporations and governments would take to suppress workers' rights. It brought national attention to the plight of industrial laborers and the brutal conditions they faced. Although the strike ultimately ended without achieving its immediate goals, the massacre underscored the urgent need for labor reforms and galvanized support for workers' rights. The legacy of the Ludlow Massacre includes significant reforms in labor law and the eventual recognition of unions as a legitimate voice for workers. It remains a stark reminder of the human cost of industrial exploitation and the sacrifices made by those who fought for fair treatment and dignity in the workplace. The site of the massacre is now a memorial, commemorating the lives lost and the enduring struggle for justice in the labor movement. The Janadenhutton Massacre, 1782. The Janadenhutton Massacre of 1782 was a grim and tragic event during the American Revolutionary War, marked by the brutal killing of nearly 100 Christianized Lenape, Delaware, Native Americans by a group of American militiamen. The massacre occurred in Janadenhutton, a Moravian missionary settlement in the Ohio Territory, and remains one of the most infamous examples of violence against Native Americans in early American history. The Lenape of Janadenhutton were part of a broader group of Native Americans who had been converted to Christianity by Moravian missionaries, adopting a largely pacifist way of life. Despite their neutrality during the Revolutionary War, their location in the contested Ohio Valley placed them in the middle of ongoing hostilities between American settlers and Native American tribes, many of whom allied with the British. In the months leading up to the massacre, tensions in the region escalated due to raids by Native American groups on American frontier settlements. These attacks were not conducted by the Christian Lenape, who had maintained their commitment to peace, but settlers often made little distinction between hostile and non-hostile native groups. In early 1782, after one such raid, American militiamen from Pennsylvania, led by Colonel David Williamson, marched into the Ohio Territory seeking retribution. The militia arrived at Gnadenhutten, where the Lenape were living in a peaceful and unarmed community. Claiming they needed to investigate the settlement for potential involvement in recent raids, the militiamen gathered the inhabitants under false pretenses. Despite finding no evidence of their complicity in the attacks, the militia accused the Lenape of aiding hostile tribes and decided to execute them. The Lenape, including women and children, were confined to 2 buildings overnight, where they prayed and sang hymns, knowing their fate was sealed. The next morning, the militiamen systematically slaughtered the captives, using mallets and other blunt instruments. By the end of the massacre, approximately 96 Lenape were dead, including men, women, and children. Only a few individuals who had been away from the settlement survived to recount the atrocity. The Gnadenhutten massacre was widely condemned, even at the time, as an appalling act of violence. It further inflamed tensions between Native Americans and American settlers, contributing to a cycle of retribution and escalating conflict in the Ohio Valley. The event also tarnished the reputation of the American militia involved, highlighting the indiscriminate and often brutal nature of frontier warfare. The massacre remains a somber reminder of the widespread violence and dispossession faced by Native Americans during the expansion of European settlement. The site of the massacre is now a memorial, honoring the lives of those who were killed and serving as a testament to the devastating consequences of prejudice, fear, and unchecked violence. The Gnadenhutten massacre continues to be a point of reflection on the darker aspects of American history and the need to acknowledge and learn from past injustices. The Galveston Hurricane, 1900. The Galveston Hurricane of 1900 was one of the deadliest natural disasters in American history, devastating the city of Galveston, Texas, and claiming the lives of an estimated 6,000 to 12,000 people. Striking on September 8, 1900, the hurricane arrived with little warning, overwhelming the low-lying island city with its immense power and leaving a legacy of destruction and resilience. At the time, Galveston was a thriving port city and one of the most prosperous in Texas. Known for its bustling economy, vibrant culture, and significant shipping industry, it was a beacon of progress in the region. However, the city's geography, situated on a barrier island with an average elevation of less than 9 feet above sea level, made it highly vulnerable to storm surges. Despite warnings from some engineers and meteorologists about the city's exposure to hurricanes, little had been done to protect it from the threat. The hurricane began as a tropical storm in the Atlantic Ocean, intensifying as it moved across the Gulf of Mexico. Meteorological science at the time was limited, and although there were signs of an approaching storm, the lack of advanced forecasting tools and communication systems left residents unprepared for the scale of the disaster. When the storm made landfall, it brought winds exceeding 140 miles per hour and a storm surge that inundated Galveston with up to 15 feet of water, submerging most of the city. The destruction was catastrophic. Homes and buildings were swept away or reduced to rubble, and entire neighborhoods were obliterated. The city's infrastructure was destroyed, and thousands of people were killed, many of whom drowned in the rising waters. Survivors faced harrowing conditions, with little shelter, food, or clean water in the aftermath of the storm. The loss of life was so immense that mass graves were dug, and some bodies were disposed of at sea to prevent the spread of disease. Despite the devastation, the people of Galveston displayed remarkable resilience. In the years following the hurricane, the city embarked on an ambitious reconstruction effort. A seawall was constructed to protect against future storms, and the entire city was elevated using sand and fill to reduce its vulnerability to storm surges. These engineering feats, along with improved weather forecasting and communication systems, were significant advancements in disaster preparedness and mitigation. The The Galveston hurricane of 1900 remains a defining moment in the history of natural disasters in the United States. It underscored the need for better infrastructure, forecasting, and emergency planning to protect vulnerable communities. The storm also marked a turning point for Galveston, which never fully regained its status as a leading port city, as nearby Houston grew to prominence in the region. The tragedy of the Galveston hurricane serves as a stark reminder of the power of nature and the importance of preparedness, resilience, and community in the face of disaster. It is a story of profound loss and human determination to rebuild and adapt in the wake of unimaginable destruction. The Battle of Blair Mountain, 1921. Largest labor uprising in U.S. history. The Battle of Blair Mountain in 1921 was the largest labor uprising in United States history and a pivotal moment in the struggle for workers' rights. Taking place in Logan County, West Virginia, it was the culmination of years of tension between coal miners and coal companies over unsafe working conditions, low wages, and the suppression of unionization efforts. The conflict reflected broader national issues of labor rights, corporate power, and the use of violence to maintain industrial control. Coal mining was the lifeblood of West Virginia's economy, but the industry was marked by exploitative practices. Miners worked in hazardous conditions for meager pay and were often paid in company scrip, which could only be used at company-owned stores. Additionally, coal companies controlled every aspect of miners' lives, including housing and local law enforcement. Efforts to unionize were met with fierce resistance, as companies hired private detectives and armed guards to intimidate workers, break strikes, and prevent union activity. The situation reached a boiling point in the early 1920s as miners increasingly sought to join the United Mine Workers of America, UMWA. Tensions were exacerbated by violent crackdowns on organizing efforts, including the Mattuon Massacre in 1920, in which pro-union forces clashed with company-hired agents. The murder of Sid Hatfield, a Union ally and key figure in the Mattuon resistance, further inflamed miners' anger and galvanized their resolve. In late August 1921, as thousands of miners marched toward Logan County to demand union recognition and protest the abuses of coal companies, they were met by a formidable force of anti-union defenders. Logan County Sheriff Don Chafin, supported by coal company funding, organized a well-armed resistance of deputies, state police, and private security forces. The miners, many of whom were veterans of World War I, were equally determined and brought their own weapons to the confrontation. For several days, an estimated 10,000 miners clashed with approximately 3,000 anti-union forces in a series of intense battles along Blair Mountain. The fighting included the use of rifles, machine guns, and even aerial bombings, as planes hired by coal companies dropped homemade bombs on miners' positions. Despite their determination, the miners were ultimately outgunned and overwhelmed. The federal government, under President Warren G. Harding, intervened by sending U.S. Army troops to the region. Facing the threat of military action, the miners dispersed, effectively ending the uprising. The aftermath of the Battle of Blair Mountain was complex and bittersweet. Although the uprising failed to achieve its immediate goal of unionizing the mines, it brought national attention to the plight of coal miners and the broader labor movement. In the years that followed, unionization efforts continued, and the New Deal era of the 1930s eventually brought significant labor reforms, including stronger protections for workers and the right to organize. The Battle of Blair Mountain remains a powerful symbol of workers' resistance against oppression and the fight for economic justice. It highlights the sacrifices made by miners and their families in the pursuit of dignity, fair treatment, and the right to collective bargaining. Today, the site of the battle is recognized as an important historical landmark, serving as a reminder of the enduring struggle for labor rights in the United States. Operation Paperclip, post-World War II recruitment of German scientists. Operation Paperclip was a secret program conducted by the United States government after World War II to recruit German scientists, engineers, and technicians, many of whom had worked for the Nazi regime. The program aimed to leverage their expertise, particularly in rocketry, aeronautics, and other advanced technologies, to gain a strategic advantage during the early stages of the Cold War. While it contributed significantly to American scientific and military achievements, the program remains controversial due to the ethical implications of employing individuals associated with the Nazi regime. As the war came to an end in 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as global superpowers, competing for technological supremacy. Both nations sought to capture Germany's scientific knowledge and resources, particularly in rocketry, which had advanced significantly under the Nazis. The German V-2 rocket program, led by Wernher von Braun, had produced the world's first long-range guided ballistic missiles, which the Nazis used to devastating effect during the war. This technology, along with the expertise of its developers, was seen as essential for military and space exploration advancements. The US government initiated Operation Paperclip to recruit these scientists and prevent their expertise from falling into Soviet hands. Initially, the program operated under the guise of denazification, with officials screening candidates to ensure they had no significant ties to the Nazi Party or its crimes. However, as the Cold War intensified, these standards were often disregarded. Many of the scientists recruited under Operation Paperclip had been members of the Nazi Party or had worked on projects directly tied to the regime's war efforts, including weapons development and forced labor. Wernher von Braun is one of the most prominent figures associated with Operation Paperclip. As the chief architect of the V-2 rocket, von Braun had been a member of the Nazi Party and the SS. Despite this, he and many of his colleagues were brought to the United States, where they played key roles in the development of American rocketry and space exploration programs. Von Braun later became a central figure in NASA, leading the development of the Saturn V rocket that enabled the Apollo missions to the Moon. While Operation Paperclip advanced American technological capabilities, particularly in the fields of missile development and space exploration, it sparked significant ethical debates. Critics argued that the program overlooked the moral responsibilities of justice and accountability by granting impunity to individuals who had contributed to the Nazi war machine. The use of former Nazi scientists raised questions about the balance between strategic interests and ethical standards in the pursuit of national security. Despite these controversies, Operation Paperclip had a profound impact on American science and technology. The program accelerated advancements in rocketry, aeronautics, and chemical engineering, contributing to military innovations during the Cold War and laying the foundation for the US space program. However, the program also serves as a reminder of the complex moral compromises made during a time of geopolitical rivalry and the lingering consequences of those decisions. The Stono Rebellion, 1739, largest slave revolt in the colonies. The Stono Rebellion of 1739 was the largest slave uprising in the British mainland colonies, reflecting the desperation and resistance of enslaved Africans against the brutal system of slavery. The rebellion took place on September 9th, near the Stono River in South Carolina, and involved a group of enslaved people who sought freedom by fleeing to Spanish Florida, where they believed they would be granted liberty. The revolt began early in the morning when a group of around 20 enslaved men, led by an Angolan named Jemmy, raided a firearms store, arming themselves and killing the storekeepers. With cries of liberty, they marched southward, attracting more followers along the way and growing to a group of approximately 100. As they moved, they attacked and killed white colonists, burned plantations, and encouraged other enslaved people to join them in their quest for freedom. The rebellion caused widespread panic among the colonial authorities and planters. The South Carolina militia quickly mobilized and confronted the rebels near the Edisto River. After a fierce battle, many of the enslaved were killed, while others were captured and later executed. A few managed to escape, but were eventually hunted down. In total, the uprising resulted in the deaths of around 25 white colonists and approximately twice as many enslaved individuals. The Stono Rebellion sent shockwaves through the colonies and had far-reaching consequences. In its immediate aftermath, colonial authorities tightened control over enslaved populations. South Carolina's legislature passed the Negro Act of 1740, which imposed harsher restrictions on enslaved people, including prohibiting them from assembling, learning to read, or earning money. The act also increased penalties for rebellious behavior and placed stricter oversight on slave owners to prevent future insurrections. The rebellion highlighted the harsh realities of slavery and the lengths to which enslaved people would go to resist their oppression. It also underscored the deep fears among white colonists about the potential for uprisings and the precarious nature of a society built on the enslavement of a large population. The Stono Rebellion stands as a testament to the resilience and agency of enslaved people, who, despite overwhelming odds, fought for their freedom and dignity. While ultimately unsuccessful, the Stono Rebellion remains a significant event in American history, symbolizing both the cruelty of the slave system and the enduring human desire for freedom. Its legacy is a reminder of the resistance and sacrifices of those who endured and fought against slavery in the colonial era. The Page Act, 1875, targeting Asian women immigrants. The Page Act of 1875 was one of the earliest pieces of federal immigration legislation in the United States and marked a significant moment in the history of exclusionary policies. Specifically targeting Chinese and other Asian immigrants, the law was the first to explicitly restrict the immigration of a specific group based on race and gender. It reflected the widespread anti-Asian sentiment of the time and the moral anxieties surrounding the presence of Asian women in the United States. The act, introduced by Representative Horace F. Page of California, was framed as a measure to curb the immigration of undesirable individuals, including those considered to be contract laborers, convicts, or prostitutes. In practice, however, it primarily targeted Chinese women, fueled by the racist stereotype that they were involved in immoral activities such as prostitution. Chinese immigrants were already facing intense discrimination due to their growing presence in the American West, particularly in California, where they were often scapegoated for economic competition and cultural differences. The Page Act reinforced these prejudices by associating Chinese women with vice and danger to American society. The enforcement of the law placed severe scrutiny on Chinese women attempting to enter the United States. Immigration officials were empowered to interrogate and examine these women, requiring them to prove they were not prostitutes or coming to the country under immoral pretenses. The invasive and humiliating process effectively barred many Chinese women from immigrating, as the burden of proof was often insurmountable. The act served as a de facto ban on the immigration of Chinese women, exacerbating the existing gender imbalance within Chinese immigrant communities and reinforcing the perception of Chinese men as isolated laborers with no familial ties. The Page Act was a precursor to broader exclusionary policies, most notably the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which banned the immigration of Chinese laborers and further institutionalized anti-Asian racism in U.S. law. Together, these laws reflected a growing movement to restrict immigration based on race and ethnicity, laying the groundwork for future discriminatory policies. The targeting of Chinese women in particular revealed how racism and sexism were intertwined in shaping immigration laws, as fears of cultural and moral contamination were projected onto immigrant women. The legacy of the Page Act is a reminder of the intersectional nature of oppression and the systemic barriers faced by marginalized groups in U.S. history. It marked the beginning of a long history of exclusionary immigration policies that targeted Asian communities and shaped the experiences of those who sought to build lives in the United States. The Act's discriminatory impact underscores the ways in which legal frameworks have been used to reinforce racial and gender hierarchies, leaving lasting scars on the affected communities. America's first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation, adopted in 1777 and ratified in 1781, served as the first Constitution of the United States, providing a framework for national governance during the early years of independence. Drafted during the Revolutionary War, the Articles reflected the newly formed states' desire to maintain their sovereignty while creating a loose union to coordinate efforts against Britain. The result was a decentralized government with limited powers, a structure that would prove both innovative and problematic. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government consisted of a single legislative body, the Confederation Congress, where each state had one vote regardless of size or population. This design ensured that smaller states would have an equal voice with larger states, reinforcing the principle of state equality. However, the national government lacked an executive branch to enforce laws and a judiciary to resolve disputes, leaving it reliant on the states for implementation of its decisions. The Articles granted Congress certain powers, including the ability to conduct diplomacy, declare war, regulate currency, and manage relations with Native American tribes. However, the government was severely constrained by its inability to levy taxes or regulate interstate and foreign commerce. Funding for national endeavors depended on voluntary contributions from the states, which were often inconsistent and insufficient. This lack of financial authority hindered efforts to pay debts from the Revolutionary War and fund the national military. The weaknesses of the Articles became increasingly evident as the young nation faced numerous challenges. Interstate disputes over boundaries and trade revealed the absence of a mechanism for resolving conflicts, while the inability to raise revenue or enforce laws undermined the government's credibility. One of the most significant crises came with Shays' Rebellion in 1786 to 1787, an armed uprising of farmers in Massachusetts protesting economic hardships and unfair taxation. The federal government's inability to respond effectively to the rebellion highlighted the limitations of the Articles and the need for a stronger central authority. Despite its shortcomings, the Articles of Confederation were an important step in the evolution of American governance. They provided a framework for collective action during the Revolutionary War and established key principles, such as the idea of a union and the recognition of state sovereignty. The experience under the Articles also informed the debates that led to the creation of the U.S. Constitution, as leaders sought to address the deficiencies of the first Constitution while preserving the ideals of republicanism and federalism. In 1787, a constitutional convention was convened to revise the Articles, but the delegates ultimately chose to draft a new constitution. The Articles of Confederation were formally replaced by the U.S. Constitution in 1789, which established a stronger federal government with separate executive, legislative, and judicial branches. While the Articles were short-lived, they remain a critical part of American history, symbolizing the early struggles of a nation finding its way and the enduring effort to balance state and federal powers. The Wilmington Insurrection, 1898, coup d'etat in North Carolina. The Wilmington Insurrection of 1898, also known as the Wilmington Massacre, was a violent coup d'etat in Wilmington, North Carolina, and is one of the darkest chapters in American history. It marked the only instance in U.S. history where a legally elected government was overthrown by force. The insurrection was fueled by white supremacist backlash against the political and economic gains made by African Americans during Reconstruction and the post-Reconstruction era. In the late 19th century, Wilmington was a thriving, majority black city with a relatively prosperous African American community. Black residents held significant political power as part of a multiracial coalition formed between the Republican Party and the Populist Party, known as the Fusionist Movement. This coalition had successfully challenged Democratic dominance in North Carolina, and African Americans held local government positions, owned businesses, and contributed meaningfully to Wilmington's cultural and economic life. The Democratic Party, dominated by white supremacists, sought to regain control by exploiting racial tensions. In the months leading up to the 1898 state elections, white Democrats launched a virulent propaganda campaign, spreading lies about black political corruption and the supposed dangers of black men to white women. Newspapers like the News and Observer published inflammatory articles and cartoons to stoke fears and justify violent action. This campaign culminated in a white declaration of supremacy, vowing to restore democratic rule by any means necessary. On November 8, 1898, Democrats won control of state offices through a combination of voter intimidation, suppression, and outright fraud. 2 days later, a mob of white supremacists, including members of the white elite and local militias, launched a coordinated attack to overthrow Wilmington's elected government. Armed with rifles and other weapons, they marched on the city, targeting black residents and Republican leaders. The mob burned down the offices of the Daily Record, an African-American-owned newspaper that had been a symbol of black achievement and resistance. They then moved through black neighborhoods, killing an estimated 60 to 300 African Americans and forcing hundreds to flee their homes. White supremacists seized control of the local government, installing their own leaders and expelling black office holders and their allies. Many prominent African Americans, including professionals and community leaders, were banished from Wilmington under threat of death. The insurrection solidified white Democratic control in North Carolina and effectively ended the political power of African Americans in the state. It also marked the beginning of an era of Jim Crow laws, which codified racial segregation and disenfranchisement across the South. Efforts to suppress black voting rights through poll taxes, literacy tests, and other discriminatory practices were intensified in the aftermath of the coup. The Wilmington insurrection was not only a devastating attack on African Americans, but also a direct assault on democracy. Its legacy was deliberately obscured for decades, with the event misrepresented in history as a race riot initiated by African Americans rather than as a premeditated coup. Only in recent years has the true story of the insurrection been more widely acknowledged, thanks to the efforts of historians and community advocates. The events of 1898 serve as a stark reminder of the fragility of democracy and the enduring impact of systemic racism. The Wilmington insurrection underscores the importance of confronting historical injustices and addressing their long-term consequences, which continue to shape social and political dynamics in the United States. The Opium Exclusion Act, 1909, precursor to drug prohibition laws. The Opium Exclusion Act of 1909 was a significant piece of legislation in United States history, marking the first federal law to prohibit the importation and possession of a specific drug. It served as a precursor to the broader drug prohibition laws that would emerge in the 20th century and reflected the intersection of racial prejudice, economic interests, and social reform movements in shaping public policy. The origins of the act lay in the growing concern over the use of opium in the United States, particularly the smoking of opium, which was associated with Chinese immigrant communities. By the late 19th century, Chinese laborers had come to the U.S. in significant numbers to work on railroads and in mining, facing widespread discrimination and hostility. The practice of smoking opium, which was culturally rooted in Chinese communities, became a focal point for anti-Chinese sentiment. Moral reformers, law enforcement, and white labor groups all targeted opium smoking as both a health crisis and a social threat, often exaggerating its dangers and associating it with criminal behavior and moral decay. While opium in medicinal forms, such as tinctures and powders, was widely used and largely accepted among the white population, the act of smoking opium carried a racialized stigma. This distinction highlighted the racial bias embedded in early drug policies, as the legislation sought to suppress a practice identified with Chinese immigrants while ignoring the widespread use of opiate-based medicines among whites. The passage of the Opium Exclusion Act was influenced by both domestic and international pressures. In the United States, progressive-era reformers were advocating for stricter regulation of substances they viewed as harmful or morally corrupting. At the same time, global trade and diplomacy played a role. The U.S. participated in the International Opium Commission in 1909, where nations convened to address the opium trade and its impact. This global context encouraged American lawmakers to align domestic policy with emerging international norms on drug control. The act specifically banned the importation of opium prepared for smoking, targeting Chinese immigrants and their cultural practices. It did not restrict the medicinal use of opium or other forms of the drug, reflecting the selective nature of the legislation. Enforcement of the law further marginalized Chinese communities, as raids on opium dens and arrests became tools of social control and a means to perpetuate anti-immigrant discrimination. The Opium Exclusion Act laid the groundwork for future drug prohibition laws, such as the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914, which expanded restrictions to include other drugs like heroin and cocaine. These early laws established patterns of racialized enforcement and punitive approaches to drug policy that continue to influence the U.S. legal and social landscape. The Opium Exclusion Act of 1909 was more than just the first step in federal drug prohibition. It was a reflection of the anxieties, prejudices, and power dynamics of its time. It illustrates how drug policies have often been shaped by factors beyond public health, including racism, economic interests, and moral reform movements. The Act's legacy is a reminder of the complex interplay between societal attitudes and lawmaking, and its impact continues to resonate in contemporary debates over drug regulation and criminal justice. The 1811 German Coast Uprising, largest slave revolt in U.S. history. The 1811 German Coast Uprising was the largest slave revolt in U.S. history, taking place along the German coast of the Mississippi River in Louisiana. The rebellion involved an estimated 200 enslaved people who sought to overthrow the system of slavery and assert their freedom. Though ultimately unsuccessful, the uprising stands as a powerful testament to the resistance and agency of enslaved individuals against the brutal institution of slavery. The German coast, named for the German settlers who had originally colonized the area, was a plantation region dominated by sugarcane production. Enslaved labor was the backbone of the local economy, and the conditions were harsh, with long hours of grueling work under the constant threat of violence. The rebellion was sparked in January 1811, under the leadership of Charles Dessalines, an enslaved man who served as an overseer on the plantation of Manuel Andre. Inspired by revolutionary movements such as the Haitian Revolution, Dessalines and his fellow conspirators sought to emulate those efforts to achieve freedom and justice. The revolt began on January 8, 1811, at Andre's plantation, where the insurgents attacked, killing the plantation owner's son and wounding Andre himself. Armed with tools, agricultural implements, and a few firearms, the rebels marched downriver toward New Orleans, recruiting more participants and growing in numbers as they advanced. Their goal was not only to escape bondage, but to establish a free black republic in Louisiana. Along the way, the rebels burned plantations and crops, destroying property that symbolized their oppression and signaling their defiance. News of the uprising spread quickly, and local authorities mobilized to suppress the rebellion. Armed militias, along with federal troops, pursued the insurgents and confronted them near the present-day town of Kenner. After a brief but violent battle, the rebellion was quashed, and many of the enslaved participants were captured. Over the following weeks, the response was brutal and uncompromising. Dozens of the captured rebels were executed, often in public displays meant to intimidate and discourage further resistance. Their severed heads were mounted on pikes along the Mississippi River as a grim warning to others. The German Coast Uprising was a significant moment in the history of slavery and resistance in the United States. It revealed the deep anger and determination of enslaved people to challenge the system that dehumanized them and demonstrated the fear that slaveholders had of collective action among the enslaved population. The rebellion also underscored the lengths to which the system of slavery would go to maintain control, using terror and violence to suppress any challenge to its authority. For many years, the German Coast Uprising was overlooked or minimized in historical accounts, reflecting a broader reluctance to acknowledge the agency and resistance of enslaved individuals. However, recent scholarship and public memory initiatives have brought greater attention to this important event, recognizing it as a profound act of courage and a critical chapter in the history of the struggle for freedom and justice. The legacy of the 1811 German Coast Uprising is a reminder of the resilience and humanity of those who resisted slavery, even in the face of overwhelming odds. It challenges us to confront the brutal realities of the past, while honoring the strength and spirit of those who fought for their liberation. The Alaska Purchase Controversy, Seward's Folly. The Alaska Purchase, finalized in 1867, was a highly controversial transaction in which the United States acquired Alaska from the Russian Empire for $7.2 million. Initially ridiculed by many Americans as a foolish and wasteful expenditure, the acquisition was derisively nicknamed Seward's Folly after Secretary of State William H. Seward, who negotiated the deal. Over time, however, Alaska proved to be an invaluable addition to the United States, reshaping perceptions of the purchase and its significance. At the time of the transaction, Russia was eager to sell Alaska due to its remote location, difficulty in defense, and limited economic returns. Russian officials feared that Alaska might eventually fall into British hands, especially given its proximity to British-controlled Canada, and viewed the United States as a more favorable buyer. For the U.S., Seward was an enthusiastic proponent of expansion and saw the acquisition as an opportunity to extend American territory, secure valuable natural resources, and bolster the nation's strategic position in the Pacific. Despite Seward's optimism, the purchase faced widespread skepticism and criticism. Many Americans viewed Alaska as an icy, barren wasteland with little to offer in terms of economic or strategic value. Newspapers mocked the deal, calling it Seward's Folly, Seward's Icebox, and Polar Bear Garden, reflecting the perception that it was a misguided use of government funds during a period of post-Civil War economic strain. Critics in Congress questioned the wisdom of spending millions on what they saw as a desolate and uninhabitable region. Seward and his supporters defended the acquisition, emphasizing Alaska's potential for resource development and its strategic importance. They pointed to its abundant natural resources, including timber, fur, and fisheries, as well as its proximity to Asian markets. Over time, these predictions would prove accurate, though it would take years for the true value of Alaska to be widely recognized. The discovery of gold in the late 19th century, particularly during the Klondike Gold Rush of the 1890s, brought new attention and wealth to the region. Alaska's vast reserves of oil, natural gas, and other minerals further demonstrated its economic potential in the 20th century. Its strategic importance became undeniable during World War II and the Cold War, as its location provided a critical defense point for the United States in the Pacific. What was once ridiculed as Seward's Folly ultimately became one of the most significant territorial acquisitions in U.S. history. The Alaska Purchase not only expanded the nation's borders, but also provided access to vast natural resources and strategic advantages that continue to benefit the United States today. The controversy surrounding the deal highlights the difficulty of predicting the long-term value of territorial expansion and serves as a reminder of how perceptions of such decisions can shift dramatically over time. The Ghost Dance Movement and Wounded Knee Massacre, 1890. The Ghost Dance Movement and the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890 represent a tragic and pivotal moment in the history of Native American resistance and U.S. government suppression. Rooted in the desperation and cultural disintegration faced by native tribes during the late 19th century, the Ghost Dance was a spiritual and cultural movement that sought to restore native lands, traditions, and autonomy. Its violent suppression at Wounded Knee marked the end of large-scale armed resistance by Native Americans against the U.S. government and underscored the devastating impact of federal policies on indigenous peoples. The Ghost Dance movement emerged in the late 1880s, inspired by the teachings of a Paiute prophet named Wovoka. He envisioned a renewal of native life through a sacred dance, which he claimed would bring the restoration of the land, the return of buffalo herds, and the removal of white settlers from native territories. The movement spread rapidly among tribes suffering from poverty, displacement, and the destruction of their traditional way of life due to U.S. expansion and assimilation policies. The Lakota Sioux, in particular, embraced the Ghost Dance as a source of hope and spiritual empowerment during a time of severe hardship on reservations. The movement, however, alarmed U.S. officials and settlers. To them, the Ghost Dance appeared as a form of rebellion, despite its primarily spiritual and non-violent nature. The U.S. government, already wary of native resistance following decades of conflict, responded with increasing hostility. Tensions escalated further when Sitting Bull, a revered Lakota leader, was killed in December 1890 during a botched attempt to arrest him, heightening fears among the Sioux and U.S. authorities alike. In the weeks following Sitting Bull's death, U.S. military forces moved to disarm and control the Lakota people. On December 29, 1890, a group of about 350 Lakota men, women, and children were intercepted by the 7th Cavalry near Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. While the group had largely surrendered, tensions flared during the disarmament process, and a shot was fired. Its origins remain unclear. What followed was a massacre, as U.S. soldiers opened fire on the Lakota, killing an estimated 250 to 300 individuals, many of whom were unarmed and attempting to flee. The Wounded Knee Massacre was a devastating and symbolic event, marking the culmination of decades of violence, displacement, and cultural destruction inflicted on Native Americans by the U.S. government. It also represented the brutal suppression of the ghost dance movement and the broader Native resistance it symbolized. The massacre is often considered the end of the so-called Indian Wars, as it effectively crushed organized armed resistance by Native tribes against federal forces. In the aftermath, Wounded Knee became a potent symbol of the suffering and resilience of Native Americans. It highlighted the extent to which U.S. policies aimed to eradicate indigenous cultures and sovereignty, replacing them with forced assimilation and reservation systems. For Native peoples, the massacre remains a profound reminder of the loss and injustice they endured and a cornerstone of their collective memory and resistance. The Ghost Dance movement and the Wounded Knee Massacre illustrate the complex dynamics of cultural survival, spiritual resistance, and systemic oppression. They serve as a reminder of the enduring struggles faced by Native Americans and the importance of acknowledging and addressing the historical injustices that continue to shape their lives. The Freeman Field Mutiny, 1945. Early civil rights protest in the military. The Freeman Field Mutiny of 1945 was a pivotal yet often overlooked event in the history of the civil rights movement, representing an early and courageous stand against racial discrimination in the U.S. military. This act of defiance by African American officers in the Army Air Forces occurred at Freeman Field in Indiana, where systemic racism and segregation were entrenched despite the critical contributions of black service members during World War II. At the heart of the mutiny was the clash between African American officers of the 477th Bombardment Group and the discriminatory policies enforced by their white commanding officers. The 477th, composed of black pilots trained at the prestigious Tuskegee Institute, was a symbol of the broader struggle for racial equality within the armed forces. Despite their skill and commitment, these men faced segregation, limited opportunities for advancement, and exclusion from facilities designated for white officers. In April 1945, the tensions at Freeman Field reached a breaking point when the base commander, Colonel Robert Selway, issued an order designating the Officers' Club as a white-only facility. Black officers were relegated to a separate and inferior facility, reinforcing the demeaning practice of segregation. The officers of the 477th, many of whom were highly educated and aware of the growing demands for civil rights, viewed this as a blatant violation of military regulations and their personal dignity. In protest, several black officers attempted to enter the White Officers Club, asserting their right to equal treatment. Over 2 days, more than 100 officers were arrested for defying Selway's orders. Their actions were described as mutiny, a term that carried severe implications, including potential court-martial and imprisonment. However, the officers maintained that their actions were not an act of rebellion, but a demand for justice and adherence to military policy, which technically prohibited segregation in officers' facilities. The Freeman Field Mutiny drew national attention and highlighted the contradictions between the United States' fight for freedom abroad and its discriminatory practices at home. Although most of the arrested officers were eventually released without charges, the incident underscored the urgent need for reform within the military. It also demonstrated the resolve of African American service members to challenge racism and demand equality, laying the groundwork for future civil rights activism. The mutiny contributed to the growing pressure on the U.S. military to address racial discrimination. In 1948, President Harry S. Truman issued Executive Order 9981, mandating the desegregation of the armed forces, a significant step toward racial equality. The Freeman Field Mutiny thus stands as a critical moment in the fight against segregation, exemplifying the courage of black officers who risked their careers to confront injustice. The legacy of the Freeman Field Mutiny is a reminder of the role that African American service members played in the broader civil rights struggle, challenging the status quo long before the landmark protests of the 1950s and 1960s. Their defiance not only challenged military segregation, but also laid a foundation for the transformation of American society toward greater equality and justice. The Green Corn Rebellion, 1917. Anti-draft uprising. The Green Corn Rebellion of 1917 was a short-lived but significant anti-draft uprising in rural Oklahoma during World War I. It reflected the deep-seated discontent among poor farmers and tenant laborers over conscription, economic inequality, and the increasing encroachment of government authority into their lives. Although the rebellion was quickly suppressed, it remains a striking example of grassroots resistance during a time of intense national and international upheaval. The roots of the rebellion lay in the economic struggles of tenant farmers, many of whom were impoverished and felt alienated from the political and economic structures of the United States. These farmers, a mix of poor whites, African Americans, and Native Americans, were particularly affected by exploitative sharecropping arrangements, which kept them in perpetual debt to landowners. Many of these individuals were also members or sympathizers of the Socialist Party, which had gained popularity in the region by advocating for economic justice, land reform, and opposition to the growing influence of industrial capitalism. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, requiring men to register for the draft. This was deeply unpopular among many rural communities, especially in Oklahoma, where resistance to the war was tied to broader frustrations with government policies that seemed to serve the interests of wealthy elites. Draft resistance was also fueled by ideological opposition to the war itself, which many socialists viewed as a conflict driven by imperialist ambitions rather than the defense of democracy. In August 1917, a group of disaffected tenant farmers and socialist organizers planned an armed uprising to resist the draft. The rebellion was centered in Seminole and Hughes counties, where a network of small, secretive groups, calling themselves the Working Class Union, plotted to disrupt the draft and oppose U.S. involvement in the war. Their plans included marching to Washington, D.C., to overthrow the government, using guerrilla tactics to sabotage war efforts, and living off the land by eating green corn, which was in season, hence the name of the rebellion. The rebellion began with a small group of armed men gathering in rural Oklahoma, but it was quickly discovered by local authorities. The insurgents set out to recruit others and allegedly burned bridges and cut telephone lines to disrupt communication. However, the movement failed to gain momentum, as most local farmers either feared government retaliation or disagreed with the rebellion's objectives. Within days, the uprising was crushed by law enforcement and vigilante groups. Many of the rebels were arrested, and some were imprisoned for their actions. The Socialist Party, already under scrutiny for its opposition to the war, faced intensified repression and declining public support. The Green Corn Rebellion was significant because it exposed the deep divisions within American society during World War I. It highlighted the economic struggles and political disillusionment of rural, agrarian communities, particularly in the South and Midwest, where poverty and systemic inequality were pervasive. The rebellion also underscored the vulnerability of dissenting voices during a time of heightened nationalism and government control, as those who opposed the war were often branded as traitors or radicals. Although the Green Corn Rebellion failed to achieve its goals, it serves as a reminder of the complex interplay between economic inequality, political resistance, and grassroots movements in American history. The event remains a testament to the desperation and courage of those who sought to challenge a system they believed was unjust, even in the face of overwhelming odds. History is far more than a collection of dates and events. It's a tapestry of stories, choices, and consequences that have shaped the world we live in today. As we've explored this iceberg of US history, we've seen how the layers beneath the surface hold as much, if not more, significance than what's widely remembered. The deeper we go, the more we uncover about who we are as a nation and the complexities of our past. These stories aren't just history. They're a mirror reflecting the struggles, triumphs, and lessons that continue to resonate in our lives. Thank you for diving in with us. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep exploring.